We spend billions of dollars pointing telescopes at galaxies so distant that the light reaching us left them before the Earth even existed, and yet, the one place we almost never think to look is directly beneath our feet. The ground you're standing on right now is the surface of a planet that stretches 6,371 kilometers to its very center, and the deepest hole any human being has ever managed to drill into it barely scratched the first fraction of a percent of that distance. We have more detailed maps of the surface of Mars than we do of our own planet's interior. And what little we do know about the layers beneath us is, in many ways, stranger and more extreme than anything we've found anywhere else in the solar system. So, in this video, we're going to take a journey from the topsoil all the way down to the very core of the Earth, stopping along the way at some of the most remarkable things hidden beneath the surface. The place to start is somewhere that might seem almost too familiar to be interesting, which is just a few centimeters below the ground. At a depth of around 30 centimeters, or roughly a foot, you are already in a world that most people will never truly see. This thin band of topsoil is home to an almost incomprehensible density of life. A single teaspoon of healthy soil contains more individual microorganisms than there are people on Earth, and that's before you factor in the insects, the fungi, and the larger burrowing animals that have been quietly running their own civilization down there, while we walk around above them, completely oblivious. Earthworms alone are essentially the planet's most important unpaid agricultural workers. They turn the soil constantly, breaking down organic material and creating the conditions that allow plant roots to breathe. Without them, the vast majority of the world's agriculture simply wouldn't function the way it does. Go a little deeper, down to about 2 meters, and you reach the depth that cultures around the world have traditionally used for burial. That number is not an accident. It's deep enough that scavenging animals are unlikely to disturb a grave, but shallow enough that the soil can be dug with hand tools in a reasonable amount of time. And for archaeologists, these graves have been some of the most important windows into the past. Civilizations that left behind very little in the way of written records often left quite a lot in the way of what they chose to bury alongside their dead. Go a little further, down to about 4 meters, and you reach the depth where some of history's most extraordinary discoveries have been made. It was at roughly this level that archaeologists in 1922 broke through into the tomb of the pharaoh Tutankhamun, sealed for more than 3,000 years. Inside were over 5,000 individual objects, including chariots, gilded furniture weapons, and the now famous golden mask. The reason so many of them survived in such remarkable condition came down to the near complete absence of light, air movement, and moisture. The dry heat of the Egyptian desert combined with those few meters of rock and soil created conditions so stable that organic materials like wood and fabric survived intact across 3 millennia. At around 10 meters deep, we arrive at one of the most impressive feats of underground construction in modern history. During the Vietnam War, the Viet Cong built a tunnel network in the Cu Chi district that stretched for more than 250 kilometers, dug almost entirely by hand, using basic tools, in secret, while a war was being fought overhead. The tunnels weren't just passageways, they were a fully functioning underground infrastructure with field hospitals, kitchens with vented cooking fires designed so the smoke would disperse far from the entrance weapons facilities, command centers, and living quarters where soldiers spent months at a time without surfacing. American forces knew the tunnels existed and spent years trying to neutralize them. But the depth, complexity, and scale of the network made that extraordinarily difficult. The tunnels are partially intact today and have become one of the most visited historical sites in Vietnam. Not far from the same depth range, governments around the world were doing something similar for different reasons. Bunkers built during the Cold War era were designed to survive a nuclear exchange, constructed at depths between 20 and 60 meters and equipped with their own power water communications and enough supplies to sustain hundreds of people in complete isolation. The pressure that surrounding soil and rock exerts on any structure at these depths is immense, which is part of why these facilities were so expensive and technically demanding to build. Passing 20 meters takes us to one of the most unusual human spaces ever created, which is the Paris catacombs. By the late 18th century, the city's cemeteries were so catastrophically overcrowded that the conditions were creating serious public health risks for neighboring neighborhoods. The solution was to use the existing network of old limestone quarry tunnels beneath the city as a permanent ossuary. Over several years, the remains of somewhere between 6 and 7 million people were transferred into these passages, their bones stacked and arranged along the walls. Today, the catacombs extend for roughly 300 kilometers beneath the streets of Paris, a subterranean mirror of the city above, where commuters and tourists move around, completely unaware that a few dozen feet below them sits one of the largest collections of human remains anywhere on Earth. At this depth, the limestone absorbs surface sound almost entirely, and the silence in the tunnels is described by visitors as unlike anything they've experienced anywhere else. At 105 meters, or nearly 350 feet, we reach the deepest metro station in the world. Arsenal Station in Kyiv, Ukraine, sits at this extraordinary depth largely because of the geology of the terrain beneath the city. Getting to the platform requires riding an escalator for more than 5 minutes, which is long enough that first-time visitors often start to wonder if something has gone wrong. The engineering required to build a station here is substantially more complex than a typical underground railway. The pressure exerted by the surrounding rock on the tunnel walls at this depth is severe enough that the structural specifications have to be calculated with extreme precision, and the materials used have to bear loads that would flatten ordinary concrete construction. At 120 meters, we find what is currently the world record for the deepest known root system of any plant, belonging to a wild fig tree found in a cave system in South Africa. The roots had worked their way through microscopic fractures in the rock over what must have been decades, pushing down to where a thin supply of groundwater was accessible. When you think about what a root is actually doing at that depth, traveling through solid stone in total darkness with no guarantee of finding anything at the end, it reframes the way you think about what plants are capable of. At 3,000 meters underground, you are deeper than any human being has ever been in person, and the conditions have become genuinely alien. The rock, under this much pressure, is in a near constant state of slow creep, meaning that tunnels cut through it have a tendency to close on their own over time. Rockburst events where stored pressure is suddenly released from the surrounding stone are a persistent danger, producing explosions of rock from tunnel walls with almost no warning. The Mponeng gold mine in South Africa, the deepest active mine on Earth at around 4 kilometers, combats the extreme heat of the surrounding rock by pumping in enormous volumes of ice-cold slurry. Without it, the working environment at those depths would be fatal within minutes. At 9,000 meters and beyond, we arrive at the absolute limit of human direct exploration, which is the Kola super-deep borehole in Russia. This project began in 1970 and continued for 22 years with the goal of drilling as deep into the Earth's crust as technology would allow. The hole is only about 23 centimeters wide, barely enough to fit a large dinner plate, but it descended to a final depth of 12,262 meters, deeper than the Mariana Trench is below sea level. The project didn't end because the team ran out of funding or patience, though funding did eventually become a problem. It ended because the rock at that depth behaved in a way nobody had anticipated. Below around 9,000 meters, the temperature had climbed to roughly 180 degrees Celsius, and at that heat, the rock became almost plastic. It flowed slowly under pressure, and the walls of the borehole would close in around the drill bit almost immediately after it passed through, sealing the hole behind it and making any further progress impossible. After 22 years, the deepest hole ever drilled stopped at roughly 1/3 of 1% of the distance to the planet's center. But even so, the Kola Borehole delivered discoveries that genuinely surprised the scientific community. The biggest was water. At a depth of 7 kilometers, the team found significant quantities of water trapped in the rock, contradicting the prevailing assumption that none could exist there. It wasn't surface water that had seeped down over time. It appeared to have been produced by the rock itself, through a chemical process in which hydrogen and oxygen were forced out of the minerals under extreme pressure. Along with the water, they also found fossilized microorganisms at depths where life had previously been considered completely impossible. And perhaps most significantly, the project disproved one of the most basic models of the Earth's crust taught in geography classrooms for decades. The existing theory predicted that at a certain depth, granite would give way to a layer of basalt. The drill never found any basalt. The granite continued all the way down, fractured and altered by heat and pressure, but geologically continuous in a way that no one had expected. With the Kola Borehole as the absolute physical limit of direct exploration, everything below 12 kilometers is understood not through drilling, but through seismology. When an earthquake occurs, it sends waves of energy radiating outward in every direction, including straight down through the interior of the planet. Different materials transmit these waves at different speeds and in different ways, and by measuring the time it takes for those waves to travel between an earthquake source and monitoring stations around the world, scientists can infer an enormous amount about the density, temperature, and physical state of the material the waves pass through. It is, in a sense, like doing an MRI of the planet using naturally occurring energy, and it is the primary reason we know anything at all about the deep interior. What seismology has revealed is a planet divided into 4 main layers. The outermost is the crust, which is the part we live on. Under the continents, it averages about 35 kilometers thick, and under the oceans, it thins down to between 5 and 7 kilometers. If you scaled the Earth down to the size of a chicken egg, the crust would be thinner than the eggshell in proportion to the total diameter. It is rigid, brittle, and broken into the tectonic plates, whose movement over millions of years has rearranged the continents, built mountain ranges, and opened and closed entire ocean basins. Below the crust begins the mantle, extending from roughly 35 kilometers down to about 2,900 kilometers, and accounting for around 84% of the planet's total volume. The material here is rock in a technical sense, but it behaves nothing like the rock we encounter on the surface. Under the combination of extreme heat and enormous pressure, the mantle exists in a strange intermediate state somewhere between solid and liquid. Given enough time, which in geological terms means thousands to millions of years, it moves. The upper mantle circulates in a process called convection, where hotter material near the boundary with the core rises slowly toward the crust, cools slightly, and sinks again. This circulation is the engine that drives plate tectonics, and through that, essentially every major geological event on the surface, every earthquake, every volcanic eruption, every centimeter of continental drift over the past 4 billion years traces its energy back to this slow churning of rock in the dark. At roughly 2,900 kilometers down, seismic waves undergo a dramatic and sudden change in behavior that tells us we've crossed from the mantle into the outer core. The outer core is approximately 2,200 kilometers thick and, unlike the mantle, is entirely liquid. It is composed primarily of iron and nickel, and its temperature ranges from around 4,000 degrees Celsius at the boundary with the mantle to something approaching 5,000 degrees deeper in, which is comparable to the surface temperature of the Sun. This liquid iron is in constant motion, and it is that motion which produces one of the most essential features of the planet from the perspective of everything that lives on its surface, which is the Earth's magnetic field. As the electrically conducting iron rotates and circulates, it generates electrical currents, and those currents generate the magnetic field that surrounds the planet. That field deflects the constant stream of charged particles from the Sun that would otherwise strip away the atmosphere and bombard the surface with radiation levels incompatible with complex life. The safety of the surface environment is directly tied to what is happening in a churning ocean of liquid metal nearly 3,000 kilometers beneath your feet. The final destination, beginning at a depth of 5,150 kilometers and extending to the very center at 6,371 kilometers, is the inner core. And it presents one of the most counterintuitive facts in all of Earth science. The inner core is hotter than the outer core. Its temperature at the very center is estimated at around 6,000 degrees Celsius, as hot as the surface of the Sun. And yet it is completely solid. Not partially solid, entirely solid, a sphere of iron and nickel roughly 2,400 kilometers across that refuses to melt despite a temperature that would vaporize steel at the surface. The reason it stays solid is pressure. The inner core sits under the weight of the entire planet, generating a pressure roughly 3.5 million times higher than atmospheric pressure at the surface. Under those conditions, the iron atoms are packed together so densely that even at 6,000 degrees they cannot move freely enough to become liquid. The inner core also rotates slightly faster than the rest of the planet, completing its rotation in a fraction less time than the surface above it, a phenomenon called superrotation that adds up to roughly one extra full rotation every few hundred years. And at the boundary between the liquid outer core and the solid inner core, there is an ongoing process of crystallization. As the planet slowly cools over geological time, liquid iron at this boundary gradually solidifies and adds a thin new layer to the inner core each year. That process releases heat, which helps sustain the convection in the outer core that drives the magnetic field. It is a self-sustaining system, but it is not permanent. Over billions of years, as more of the outer core solidifies, the convection will weaken, the magnetic field will eventually collapse, and without it, the atmosphere will slowly erode. That process is likely billions of years away, But it is worth knowing that the thing keeping this planet habitable is not a fixed feature. It is a process that is slowly winding down. What makes all of this particularly striking is the scale of what we cannot know through direct observation. The Kola Borehole, the deepest physical intrusion into the planet ever achieved, reached 12 kilometers. The center of the Earth is 6,371 kilometers away. The entire body of direct physical evidence we have ever collected from the interior represents roughly 0.19% of that total distance. Everything else is inference modeled from seismic data, gravity measurements, laboratory experiments at extreme pressures, and comparisons with other rocky planets. The picture we've assembled is detailed and well supported, but it remains a model of something we have never seen, and almost certainly never will. There is something genuinely humbling about that. We live on the surface of a machine whose working parts we cannot reach and whose behavior we can influence in almost no way. The churning of the mantle, the circulation of the outer core, and the slow crystallization of the inner core are processes that have been running since shortly after the planet formed 4.5 billion years ago, and they will continue long after anything alive today has ceased to exist. The ground beneath your feet is not a stable foundation in any permanent sense. It is the outer skin of a slowly evolving system, one thin layer of solid rock floating on a planet that in its deepest parts is still very much alive. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. If you have a topic or suggestion, feel free to submit it through the form in the description, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.